Let's be honest for a moment. When Jonathan and Suzy announced their new ministry, almost everybody thought they already knew how the story would go. A young Christian couple. A rising online presence. A ministry launch that looked polished, blessed, and perfectly timed. People expected success. People expected clarity. People expected God's calling to shine through without confusion. But here's the part no one expected. Almost immediately after their ministry launch, something shifted. Not publicly. Publicly everything still looked beautiful. But behind the scenes, a pressure began to build. A tension started to rise. And quietly, people around them began asking a question Jonathan and Suzy never thought they would hear. Is this really God's calling, or is this turning into a family business? Now, before we go any deeper, I want you to stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't gossip, it isn't judgment, and it isn't an attack on their lives or their faith. No, what we're doing right now is something much more important. We're going behind the curated posts, behind the public excitement, behind the launch day applause, to look at the real struggle that many couples face when they step into ministry. And Jonathan and Suzy? They're not alone. In fact, their story might sound more familiar than you expect. Because if you've ever wondered how a ministry that begins with passion can suddenly feel like pressure, if you've ever questioned how a calling can get mixed with expectations, or how family involvement can quietly reshape spiritual direction, then Jonathan and Suzy's journey is one you need to hear. Now let me tell you why this matters right now. Ministries don't collapse overnight. They drift. Slowly. Quietly. One small decision at a time. And that's exactly why this story is so important. Because the warning signs, the pressure, the confusion, the blurred lines between calling and family, they didn't appear all at once. They showed up little by little, until the couple looked around and realized, this doesn't feel like what God showed us. That is the moment everything changed. And that is the moment you're about to see. But before I unpack the full story, before we break down the turning points, the silent tension, the behind-the-scenes decisions, I need you to watch closely. Because somewhere inside this story, there's a lesson every believer, every couple, and every leader needs to understand. Now here's the payoff preview, the moment you're staying for. You're going to see the exact moment Jonathan and Suzy realized their ministry was being shaped by something other than God's voice. You're going to see what forced them to pause everything. And you're going to see the decision that almost broke their marriage, but ended up saving their calling. This next part will change the way you look at ministry launches, leadership pressure, and spiritual direction altogether. So let's begin. Before their ministry launch, Jonathan and Suzy seemed unstoppable. They prayed, they planned, they dreamed. And honestly, they were excited, truly excited. They believed God had called them to build something that would help people, restore hope, and bring clarity. But what they didn't expect was how quickly things could get complicated, not because they had the wrong intentions, but because calling and pressure often look very similar in the beginning. And that's where a lot of people miss it. Because from the outside, everything still looks like God's move. But from the inside, the deeper you step into ministry, the louder the noise becomes. Family opinions, expectations, responsibilities, financial pressure, public eyes watching your every move. In other words, the perfect conditions for confusion. And Jonathan and Suzy? They were about to walk right into that confusion, without even realizing it. So now that the stage is set, let's take a step back. Let's slow the story down. Let's go to the very beginning. Because to understand how they drifted, you have to understand how they started. Before we talk about the tension, the confusion, and the unexpected shift inside Jonathan and Suzy's ministry, we need to understand where everything started. Because the truth is, most ministry problems don't begin with bad intentions. They begin with good intentions that get overpowered by pressure. And Jonathan and Suzy? Their intentions were good. Their hearts were sincere. Their passion was real. The problem wasn't their desire to serve God. The problem was everything that began to surround that desire. Let's go back to the beginning. Long before they ever launched their ministry, Jonathan and Suzy were known as the couple with a calling. People said it, friends believed it, and even they themselves felt it deep inside. Jonathan had a natural gift for preaching, not loud, not dramatic, but genuine. People listened to him because he spoke from the heart, not from a desire to impress. Suzy, on the other hand, had something Jonathan didn't: structure. She was organized, graceful under pressure, calm during storms, and incredibly gifted in administration. You give Suzy a vision, and she will turn it into a plan. You give Jonathan a plan, and he will turn it into a message. Together, they looked like the perfect ministry team. So when they started talking about launching their own ministry, no one was surprised. Friends encouraged them. Mentors affirmed them. Social media followers cheered them on. In the Christian world, they looked like the next rising power couple. But here is where the story begins to shift. A calling is spiritual, but ministry work is practical. And when the practical grows faster than the spiritual, cracks begin to form. From the moment they announced the launch, something subtle but dangerous happened. Expectations began forming around them. People expected them to grow fast. People expected them to be successful. People expected them to look like every other polished ministry online. And with every expectation placed on them, Jonathan and Suzy felt the pressure to perform, even before their ministry had truly begun. Now, here's where things get interesting. Instead of building slowly, instead of seeking deeper clarity, instead of surrounding themselves with spiritual guidance, they started building quickly, because everyone was watching. And when everyone is watching, it's easy to start moving for the audience instead of for God. Was it intentional? No. But pressure doesn't need permission to grow, it only needs opportunity. And the launch gave it just that. From the beginning, Suzy noticed things Jonathan didn't. Not because she was more spiritual, but because she had a different kind of awareness. She paid attention to patterns. She noticed shifts. She sensed when something didn't feel right. Shortly after their launch, Suzy felt something unsettling, a small but persistent sense that things were moving too fast. She tried to say it gently. "Jonathan, maybe we should slow down a little. Maybe we need to pray more before making these next decisions." Jonathan didn't disagree. He loved her discernment. But he also felt something else: pressure. Pressure to deliver. Pressure to appear confident. Pressure to meet expectations. So while he heard her, he didn't fully listen. Not yet. Because in his mind, moving slowly looked like uncertainty. And uncertainty, in ministry, can be misinterpreted as weakness. This is how small cracks begin. Not with big mistakes. Not with scandals. But with moments when one partner sees something coming, and the other partner doesn't feel ready to face it. Now here's where the setup begins merging with the seeds of tension. At the beginning, Jonathan and Suzy assumed ministry growth would come through volunteers, people who felt called, people with spiritual passion, people aligned with a vision. But then something happened that neither of them planned for. Family members began offering help. At first, it didn't seem harmful. Jonathan's brother wanted to help with logistics. Suzy's cousin wanted to help with social media. Jonathan's uncle, who loved business, wanted to help with strategy. None of the requests sounded bad. None of the people were toxic. None of them came with evil intentions. But innocence doesn't prevent consequences. Family involvement can be beautiful, but it can also blur lines. And every time a family member was added, Suzy felt something tightening inside her chest. She worried the ministry was beginning to look like something they never discussed, a family project instead of a divine calling. Jonathan, on the other hand, didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. He believed helping family was a sign of kindness. He believed giving opportunities was a form of love. And in the early days, when everything felt overwhelming, extra hands seemed like a blessing. But this is the part people often forget. Not every helping hand is a called hand. And when someone without a calling holds a spiritual position, the ministry feels it first. The people feel it next. The leaders feel it last. With each new family member joining, the ministry's direction began to shift, not dramatically, but quietly. Meetings started sounding less like prayer and more like planning. Decisions started sounding less like obedience and more like opinions. Outcomes started sounding less like faith and more like strategy. Now don't misunderstand me, there is nothing wrong with strategy. But when strategy starts leading instead of following God's direction, ministry becomes something else entirely. Suzy sensed this shift early. Jonathan sensed it later. But the people following them, they sensed it immediately. You don't need to announce a drift for people to feel it. Spiritual misalignment has a sound. It has a weight. It has a pattern. And their ministry had begun to drift, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. But soon, that drift would turn into something impossible to ignore. As weeks passed, Jonathan and Suzy's ministry grew externally. More followers, more engagement, more invitations. But internally, a storm was building. A storm created by expectations. A storm strengthened by pressure. A storm amplified by family involvement. And the worst part, Jonathan and Suzy didn't even realize how dangerous things were becoming. Because when a ministry looks successful on the outside, it's easy to assume God is the one blessing it. But growth does not always mean grace. Acceleration does not always mean divine timing. And applause does not always mean alignment. That misunderstanding, it was about to catch up with them. Because the next phase of their journey, the part you're about to hear, is where everything begins to shake. The misunderstandings, the emotional tension, the spiritual confusion, the behind-the-scenes pressure, the moment they almost lost everything they were building. So now that you understand the beginning, it's time to step into the part of the story that changed everything. If the setup showed us where Jonathan and Suzy began, the tension reveals what almost broke them. This is the part of the journey where excitement turns into exhaustion, clarity turns into confusion, and a ministry that once felt like God's assignment begins to feel like a weight they can't carry. And as we step into this section, I want you to listen closely, because this is where so many modern ministries begin to crumble. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, silently, internally. Jonathan and Suzy reached that breaking point faster than they ever expected. It started subtly, almost harmlessly, with family members stepping in to help. But eventually, the helping turned into holding positions, and the positions turned into influence, and the influence turned into control. Jonathan's younger brother was the first. He wanted a role because he needed stability, not because he felt called. He approached Jonathan humbly, but with expectation. Jonathan didn't want to say no. How do you tell your own brother he isn't spiritually ready? So Jonathan said yes. And that one yes became the snowball effect. Soon after, a cousin wanted to manage their digital content. An uncle wanted to handle finances, because he had business experience. A sister-in-law wanted to lead the women's ministry. Every role being filled was being filled by family, not by calling. Now, hear me clearly. Family in ministry is not a problem. Family replacing calling is. And unfortunately, Jonathan didn't see the danger yet. But Suzy did. She saw volunteers, spiritually mature, passionate volunteers, stepping back quietly. They wouldn't complain. They wouldn't start conflict. They would just withdraw. And when spiritually gifted people withdraw, it is always a sign that something deeper is wrong. But Jonathan was caught between two worlds. Supporting his wife. Supporting his family. Supporting the ministry. Supporting the growing expectations. And when you try to support everyone, you eventually fail someone. Before the ministry launched, Jonathan and Suzy talked about everything. Dreams, plans, prayer topics, direction. But after the launch, something shifted. Jonathan stopped sharing as openly. Suzy stopped asking as freely. Their conversations became shorter, more cautious. And slowly, a quiet emotional distance began to form. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because calling pressure does something subtle and dangerous. It isolates leaders from the very people meant to support them. Jonathan felt he was carrying the weight of the ministry. Suzy felt she was the only one seeing the cracks forming. Neither one wanted to burden the other. So both suffered quietly. This is how marriages collapse in ministry, not through drama, but through silence. Every ministry has a turning point. Jonathan and Suzy's came during a leadership retreat they hosted early in their launch. The purpose of the retreat was simple. Pray together. Align the team. Emphasize calling. Strengthen unity. Refocus on vision. Suzy prepared tirelessly. She crafted sessions on accountability, clarity, and hearing God's voice. She prayed over every segment. But halfway through the meeting, something unexpected happened. Jonathan's uncle, one of the new advisors, stood up and said the ministry needed restructuring. Not because of prayer, not because of spiritual direction, but because family should have more control to protect the vision. The room froze. Suzy's heart dropped. Jonathan felt blindsided. The volunteers looked confused. And for the first time, someone said out loud what many had been whispering quietly. This ministry is starting to feel like a family business. Right there, in one moment, everyone felt the same shift. And that retreat, which started as a moment of unity, ended as a moment of awakening. Volunteers went home discouraged. Leaders left unsure of their roles. Jonathan and Suzy left with a wound they couldn't ignore anymore. After the retreat, tension escalated. Some volunteers stepped down. Others reduced their involvement. A few messaged privately, expressing concern about the direction. But what hurt Jonathan and Suzy the most wasn't the withdrawal, it was the confusion. Because ministry is supposed to bring clarity, not chaos. Jonathan felt ashamed. He wondered whether he had failed as a leader. He wondered whether saying yes to family had created problems he wasn't prepared to handle. Meanwhile, Suzy felt unseen. She had been raising these concerns earlier, but they were overshadowed by the pressure to move fast. And now, what she feared was coming true. The ministry was losing spiritual credibility. Not because of sin, not because of scandal, but because the structure was spiritually misaligned. Every couple has a breaking point. Jonathan and Suzy reached theirs one evening after a long argument. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about leadership roles. It wasn't even about family involvement. It was about identity. Jonathan felt he was losing control. Suzy felt she was losing purpose. Both felt they were losing the ministry they believed God had given them. Jonathan sat alone in the living room afterward, hands covering his face. He prayed a prayer no leader ever wants to pray. God, are we still walking in your direction? Or are we running in ours? Suzy joined him moments later, tears in her eyes. They didn't argue anymore. They didn't defend positions. They didn't explain themselves. They sat in quiet surrender. A moment of honesty. A moment of exhaustion. A moment of truth. That night, something shifted. For the first time since the launch, Jonathan and Suzy realized they needed to slow down. For the first time, they questioned whether God wanted them to pause. And for the first time, they saw clearly what they could no longer deny. Their ministry had become louder than God's voice. The next morning, Jonathan and Suzy made a bold decision, one that many leaders are too afraid to make. They paused the ministry. No excuses. No rebranding. No spiritualizing. Just honesty. They stopped all operations. Released all family members from leadership roles. Asked volunteers for forgiveness. And stepped away from public view. To some people, it looked like failure. But spiritually, it was the beginning of restoration. They unplugged from social media. Fasted. Prayed. Listened. Refocused. It was quiet. It was humbling. It was necessary. And slowly, very slowly, peace returned. We've walked through the excitement, the pressure, the confusion, and the breaking point. But every true ministry story doesn't end in the breakdown. It ends in what God rebuilds afterward. Now that Jonathan and Suzy had paused their ministry, stepped back, and stripped away the noise, something powerful began to happen. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, deeply, spiritually. They finally had space to hear God again. And I want you to think about something here. Sometimes the greatest act of obedience is not launching something for God. It's stopping something you launched without Him. Jonathan realized that he had allowed expectations to push him into decisions he wasn't ready for. Suzy realized she had been fighting silently instead of communicating early. And together, they realized their marriage had taken a back seat to the ministry, the very ministry they thought would strengthen them. But God used the pause to heal what pressure had broken. And as they began to rebuild, slowly, prayerfully, humbly, the ministry transformed into something different. Something clearer. Something purer. And this is the part of the story that matters most. Jonathan didn't rush back into preaching. Suzy didn't rush back into organizing events. They didn't rush at all. Instead, they went back to what mattered: prayer, scripture, counsel, rest, clarity, unity. For the first time since the launch, they weren't building for anyone's expectations. Not their family. Not their followers. Not their supporters. They were building for God again. And when you build for God, you build without fear. You build without competition. You build without confusion. You build without pressure. And you build without depending on applause. Slowly, volunteers returned. But this time, they weren't drawn by hype, they were drawn by sincerity. People who had stepped away came back with peace. And Jonathan and Suzy didn't place anybody into positions based on relationship, only on calling. No more blurred lines. No more quiet tension. No more spiritual confusion. This wasn't a family business anymore. This was a ministry again. Jonathan and Suzy's experience reveals a truth that many Christians don't like to talk about. You can love God sincerely and still build wrongly. You can start with passion and still drift from purpose. You can step into ministry and still miss the direction. And here's the part that hits hardest. You can be called and still need correction. You can be anointed and still need alignment. You can have a vision and still need a pause. And that pause is not failure. That pause is often mercy. Jonathan and Suzy learned that God doesn't bless confusion. He doesn't bless misalignment. He doesn't bless structure built on pressure. But He does bless obedience, even when obedience looks like stopping. Now let me speak to you directly. Not about Jonathan and Suzy, but about anyone watching this video right now. Some of you are leaders. Some of you are creators. Some of you are building something, a ministry, a dream, a business, a calling, a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, you feel what Jonathan and Suzy felt. You feel the pressure. You feel the expectations. You feel the drift. You feel the weight of trying to look successful, even when something inside feels off. And if that's you, then hear this. Pause before you break. Listen before you lead. Align before you advance. The story of Jonathan and Suzy isn't just a commentary. It's a mirror. A mirror that shows the danger of building too fast. A mirror that exposes the weight of expectations. A mirror that reminds us that God's voice must always lead, even when crowds are watching. When their ministry relaunched, smaller but stronger, people could feel the difference. It wasn't about image anymore. It wasn't about pleasing anyone. It wasn't about appearing perfect or professional. It was about purity, purpose, alignment, obedience. And that's what every ministry, every marriage, every calling should return to. Jonathan and Suzy learned something that all of us must remember. A calling is sacred. A ministry is spiritual. And anything spiritual cannot survive on human pressure. The moment we let people's expectations guide us, we lose direction. But the moment we let God guide us, we find clarity again. Now, before you go, let me ask you directly. What do you think Jonathan and Suzy should have done differently? Do you believe pausing the ministry was the right decision? Do you think family involvement can help, or harm, spiritual assignments? I want you to share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters. And if you want more videos that dive deep into faith, calling, and the real challenges behind ministry life, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Every week, we unpack stories just like this. Stories that help you grow, stories that make you think, stories that reveal the spiritual battles behind the scenes. So subscribe, like, and share this video if it spoke to you. And remember, sometimes the loudest ministry move you can make is the moment you finally become quiet enough to hear God's voice again.